Our executive editor, Margaret Ryan, is joining us now with a closer look on the road to Copenhagen and all the implications here. And Margaret, let's start with the announcements today from South Korea and Brazil. Something of apples to oranges in that South Korea is issuing a target for 2020 reductions. Brazil is talking about cutting emissions growth.
That's right. I mean, both are aiming at 2020 to be the measuring point, but the Republic of Korea reduction would be an absolute reduction below 2005. Now, like Japan, like the U.S., they would prefer to measure from 2005, not 1990. 1990 was a very depressed economic year in Asia, so that means it had a low number to start with. 2005 was a much more active year, and so cutting from there is a little less painful to their economies. But nonetheless, they did say a 4% cut from 2005 levels by 2020. Remember, the Republic of Korea is a very export-dependent economy. They've had to be aggressive about energy efficiency. They have to import virtually all their fossil fuels, so it's been important to them not to waste a whole lot. Their per capita usage is nowhere near what ours is. In fact, they have an active nuclear program that aims for 40% of their electricity to come from nuclear just because of this heavy dependence on fossil fuels. So while 4% doesn't sound that big, I think for South Korea to take it on is in fact something more aggressive than you might have expected. I mean, look at it like us. For them, it's a first. And on their case, under the Kyoto Protocol, which they signed, they don't have to do this. This is taken as a kind of leadership initiative. The same for Brazil. That definitely is considered one of these big emerging economies. But their cut, as you point out, is from business as usual. That means their emissions will grow only about 60% as much as they would otherwise. But in effect, I think President Lula da Silva said yesterday that he was personally going to Copenhagen after what he heard from Singapore. And he said, in fact, he was incentivized by Singapore to go and say, look, if Brazil can do this, so can the rest of you. He was effectively thumbing his nose, I think, at China, among others, the other big emerging economies that are big emitters, and have hidden behind this idea that no, it's the Kyoto Protocol. The emerging economies the developed nations have to do it first.
So we get firm commitments from a top 5 emitter and a top 10 emitter, Brazil and South Korea respectively.
Let's call them proffers, because they, at this point, that's what they are, offers to the rest of the world.
Right. Let's put it in those terms, clear. Let's talk about the top 2 emitters, though, U.S. and China, and they have some common ground here, Margaret, but this isn't anything necessarily that's new in terms of what came out of these bilateral talks.
No, I don't think so. We got another statement or set of statements about the importance of reaching agreement. We had President Obama saying, without the U.S. and China, we're the big guys. We have to do something. And you don't have President who didn't argue with that at all. We didn't hear much in the way of specifics, though, from either one. China has certainly recognized its self-interest in reducing emissions, but it still doesn't want to put those actions into an internationally verifiable treaty. That has been the big stumbling block there. And, President Obama, you kind of watch some of the video out of China, you can feel his passion on this. He would really like to see, he wants to see something big out of Copenhagen. I mean, it's clear that he thinks this is important.
And I think he'll go if he sees the possibility of something important coming.
Absolutely. I mean, there have been increasing statements to that effect coming out of the White House, out of White House sources. And, it's a little unclear, however, between today's statement in Singapore about what he actually envisions coming out of Copenhagen, what's actually a doable thing. I think the probability for some kind of fast-track aid is looking much better. The idea that the developed world would help the poorest nations who are hardest hit, the island nations sinking with rising water levels, that kind of thing. That would definitely be something operational, to use the word he used today. But, we also have today the Danish Prime Minister coming out and saying, well, Copenhagen has to include numerical targets for both carbon cutting and financial aid from the developed nations. And if that's going to be the measure, Obama's between a rock and a hard place. He can't throw out a number and be seen to bypass the congressional action. I think that's a very tough one.
Well, let's follow up on Rasmussen's statement out of Denmark today. It seems a little like throwing a dinner party and demanding that your guests bring excellent wine with them. How much gravitas does he have, Margaret? How much right does he have, just because he's the host country, to make these demands of those who are attending?
Well, you know, everybody's making demands in these negotiations. That it doesn't seem to be any limit on that. And as the host country, I think, you know, he sees what has been 2 years of work essentially being kind of downgraded and not getting to the goal they wanted it to get to. But I think it also reflects the European stress on these numerical goals. And it's really, there's a great deal that's been done in the world, even in the U.S., without numerical goals. There are a lot of, I've seen some analyses by environmental groups, for instance, that look at Waxman-Markey and say, okay, it has this 17% from 2005 by 2020 carbon cutting goal, but when you start adding in the effect of other things like a renewable electricity standard and some you know, efficiency and things like that, you're actually going to see more reduction in carbon. I mean, if that weren't true, then the U.S. wouldn't be going downhill. It wouldn't have hit a high in carbon emissions in 2007 and in the Bush administration and started going downhill from there. I mean, some of that is due to the recession, but even environmentalists acknowledge some of that is due to simply, you know, changes in policy, changes in the way we do things. And that's going to be all important there. But what you have from the Danish Prime Minister is this focus, which you tend to find in these international treaty talks, all on targets. Have to be a numerical target or it's no good. Right. Give us a number or it's no good. Yeah.
Final question, Margaret. Are we overlooking to some extent the clean energy agreements that are coming out of these bilateral meetings with the U.S. and China? This summer, two administration officials, Chu and Locke, were there and announced some agreements on clean energy. It seems that today's announcements go deeper, especially with the shale gas agreements. But is this as significant as it may seem looking from the outside in, or is everyone just too focused on Copenhagen to get the big picture?
Well, I think in the long term, these could be very significant. I mean, it basically calls for government-to-government cooperation, but also specifically brings in a number of private companies here. I mean, these agreements under the coal section specifically mention 3 companies, Peabody Coal, General Electric, and AES, as all being part of partnerships. They talk about public-private partnerships in here, as well as U.S.-China partnerships. They talk about technology exchange, information exchange, best practices. A lot of the, as I think you mentioned, a lot of the agreements when you're talking about renewable energy, when you're talking about you know, energy research, things like that. These are building on ongoing things. You know, and in fact, Secretary Chu was in or is in Beijing and did sign the agreements with his Chinese counterpart that were then announced by the 2 presidents. But the shale gas is a first, and that one is very interesting to me because, as we know, all the technology to find and exploit shale gas was developed here in the U.S. We know that there are companies like you know, European or oil companies like BP and Statoil Hydro who have invested with U.S. companies in large part to gain that technology. And this is the first indication that I've seen of China's official interest in it. China is not a gas-rich country, or at least by conventional terms. And obviously, if they could find domestic resources that left them, you know, that gained them independence in that way, it would be of great strategic importance to them.
And maybe stop building coal-fired plants and turn to gas-fired plants for lower emissions. All right, Margaret Ryan, thank you very much. Next stop, South Korea for President Obama.